So today's seminar is more always better, the authentic or inauthentic pursuit of genetic enhancements. And in coming to the seminar today, I acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thanks everybody. I'm going to hand over to Sinead and then to Chris.
Hi everyone, my name is Sinead. Thank you so much for having me. I would also like to acknowledge that sovereignty in this country was never ceded, and it is a privilege to be in Melbourne at University of Melbourne for the very first time. As my slides come up, I would like to acknowledge that this talk today is based on my PhD research at the Australian Centre for Health Law Research under three of the most incredible supervisors I had the privilege of having, Andrew McGee, Pennington and Sam Boyle. And that some of the research that I'm presenting today is what I'm sort of turning into a book, which will hopefully be coming out next year in April if peer review goes well and my jokes pass the peer review level. And so I'm looking forward to feedback if you have any, so I can fold it into the more updated version of the book. So the question that my entire PhD endeavour was based on is, do we want genetic enhancements because they're good for us or because we have sort of been made to believe that they are? And so I'm going to try to speed through 3 years of research in one short presentation. So I'm going to have to ask you to just take me on some things to be true. We can discuss them later if you have objections to them. And so very briefly to set the scene, genetic enhancements are a form of genetic modification of human DNA. And they generally come in two sort of forms, although the distinction between the two of them is one of the things in debate in literature generally. So we have gene therapies, which are the modification of DNA for the purpose of treating or preventing disease. And the majority of the research and sort of genetic interventions that are available in medicine and on the market are those that target disease. So we generally have sort of two main methods of modifying human DNA. And when I'm talking about modifying human DNA, I am talking about modifying DNA of adults or people that can consent to that particular treatment. I'm just going to take modification of embryos off the table. They come with them a host of other issues that I think can dilute some of the other really important questions in play. So we have sorts of two main methods. We have your in vivo and your ex vivo method. So your in vivo method is when we have the DNA modification materials all packaged up and we put them inside the body and the modification happens inside the body. And so these are really effective or becoming quite effective for liver diseases, brain and eye disorders and neurodegeneration associated with aging. Some of these are already available and some of these are still in the research phase. We also have ex vivo methods, which are very effective or becoming very effective for blood cell disorders, congenital diseases, and cancers. There is some very exciting research happening in the Alzheimer's space as well. Now, as with all medical treatments in the history of medicine, we take and invent something that we design for disease and then we ask where else it can fit in society. And so this is where enhancements come into the picture. And so if you accept the distinction, which I'm very sympathetic to the distinction, and half of my PhD was dedicated to proving the distinction, although as time goes on, I'm not so sure of myself anymore. Enhancements are, generally speaking, taking these sorts of DNA modifications for purposes other than those centered at disease. And so these are primarily conducted in animal models, particularly because a lot of the research happens or is intended to happen on embryos, and restrictions and regulation are very specific around what we can and cannot do with embryos. And so most of the research we have showing the efficacy and accuracy of modifying human DNA for enhancement purposes is in animals. So take what you want around the effectiveness of modifying cognitive functions, skeletal muscle mass, heart, hair color, and life extension for rats. We are not, in fact, rats. So a lot of this research is still quite prospective, but I do think that enhancement research gives us a really unique playing field to discuss some really big questions that often get diluted in embryo or stem cell research. So very briefly, the ethical landscape for discussing genetic enhancements sort of dominates around questions around whether or not modifying DNA is unacceptable because human DNA corresponds with human nature, and whether or not we think that there is something going on there, and whether or not modifying human nature is unacceptable. Other questions arise around whether or not it's playing God, whether or not parents have the right power or the autonomy or the rights to modify embryonic or prospective children's DNA, whether or not there's just something icky about genes or DNA in general. We also have a lot of other questions around justice, fairness, and equality. And so I've done a little bit of work in this space, but it's generally asking questions around how, if the government refuses to provide tax benefits already for low socioeconomic families, are they really going to provide 300 grand to help them modify their prospective embryos, or help them modify themselves? And so we have questions there around, is this going to create a sort of socioeconomic divide at the genetic level? So there's quite a few debates going on in that space. There are also questions around social impact, so particularly derived from the disability scholarship. What does it say about the kinds of people or the kinds of traits if we think that it's a good idea to modify them and improve them? And then there are also so many debates around the very concepts at play. What is human nature? What does it mean to enhance someone? And is enhancement really distinct from therapy at all? The argument sort of goes, if therapy and enhancement are the same thing, then the reasons for which we justify therapy and healthcare extend to enhancement. Therefore, we should treat like cases alike, and enhancements are just as acceptable as therapy. I will try to stay away from that debate because whilst I find it fascinating, many people just, quite frankly, don't care. So one of the things I found in my research on a lot of the literature that's getting published around enhancements is that there isn't a lot for one paper by one of the people sitting right here on beneficence, well-being, and the claims that enhancements are in fact as good for us as we think they are. So there seems to be this sort of acceptance on both sides of the spectrum of the debate that they are in fact good for you. We see this in the way claims are made to enhance is to make better. The word enhance is considered synonymous with the word improve. Therefore, enhancements are normatively better for you. And so it's very difficult to get around that sort of normative claim if it's inherent in the definition of what enhancements are. Now, if we take that sort of presumption that they are by definition good for you with this other principle, which is the autonomous right to self-determination, you have the right to do what you want with your body. If it's good for you and it's your body, then there is a very high moral threshold of permissibility, which is why so much of the debate has then gone round to that justice question. And the only reason to deny access to it, to deny we should have it, is because it may cause harm to others. So I thought this was very interesting, and I wanted to go back to the basics and ask in what circumstance is it actually good for you? Where did this idea come from? And I wanted to go to the philosophy of well-being to ask, is there a defensible theory of the good life, or what well-being means, and how do genetic enhancements actually fit into that picture? Are they by definition good for you, and how can we avoid that circular reasoning? And so this is one of the things I'm going to have to ask you to take me on, which is that Sinead Prince in the year 2024 discovered the meaning of life, which we have been searching for since the beginning of time. Just trust me, I got it. I figured it out. So I don't have time today, but I did in my PhD, I went through the subjective theories of well-being in the philosophy literature, like hedonism, desire-based theories. I also looked to objective theories, including pluralism and objectiveless theories, and I all found them wanting for one reason or another. So trust me on this one. I got it. I found the one. I found the one to rule them all. And so I landed, and to me, Wayne Sumner's theory of well-being as life satisfaction made the most sense. It catered for a lot of the cautions and the questions and criticisms I had of these other theories, and it sort of seemed to fold them all in quite nicely together, although there are some concerns with it. But trust me, this is one, and we're going to go with it for today. And so Wayne Sumner argues that well-being is when we authentically evaluate our lives as meeting our ideal life. So it's this idea that well-being is not happiness, it's not an emotion. It's also not merely just the acquisition of a bunch of objective goods like a relationship and a sense of achievement or having good health. It's this idea that, yes, well-being has to be something inherently that you feel for yourself about your life as a whole. But it's not purely subjective. It does have that authenticity criterion, which is the idea that when you turn to evaluate your life as a whole, you do so in an authentic way. And that's actually an objective criterion. It says that when someone doesn't make that authentic evaluation, we can't be sure that they actually have well-being. So when Sumner defines what authenticity means, he sort of goes in a different direction to what a lot of the philosophy literature does, which it goes into positive accounts of authenticity. They try to say what you need to have in order to have authenticity. Sumner just starts at the basics and goes, okay, we all agree what it's not. And it's not being deceived. It's not being deceived about two important things. One is the state of the world, and the other is the state of your mind. So the state of the world condition is that, say when you decide that you have well-being because you have a really great partner, you have really great friends, and you believe that those are really happy relationships, and for that reason you're really satisfied with your life. Sumner goes, okay, but if you've been deceived about that and they actually don't like you at all, it's not an authentic evaluation. It's not saying there's something wrong with you, it's just that you haven't had the opportunity to make an authentic evaluation. Now, for the sake of my critics, for the sake of medical law, in which we have informed consent already at play to make sure that scientists and doctors and institutions are not lying to you when you go to seek a particular intervention, for the sake of my PhD, I just accepted that this would be true. If there is a circumstance in the future in which genetic enhancement is being provided to you, you are already protected by law for them not to lie to you about the nature, effect, and risks of those enhancements. Although that's sort of up for debate in the way that we often over-valorize genetic enhancements in the media. But let's just accept that, take that for granted, and move on to what I think is the more interesting question. So the second criteria in the authenticity evaluation is the autonomy criterion. Now, autonomy obviously is widely and hotly debated as to what it actually means, but there is one thing that generally both feminist and liberal accounts of autonomy agree on, and that's what autonomy is not, which is it is not a situation in which you've been manipulated about the values upon which you base your decision. Obviously, feminists go more and they say that there are other things at play. But given that this is a sort of a state of unanimity around what we know autonomy to be, at least necessarily, maybe not sufficiently, then we can sort of take this as a really good lens with which to analyse genetic enhancements. And essentially they say, or Sumner says, that the evaluation must be free from manipulation. When you go to look at what your ideal life is, the values that you measure what that ideal life is have to be yours, in the sense that you haven't been manipulated into holding them. Obviously, there is so much literature on what manipulation is, and generally they sort of agree around sort of one main form of manipulation across two different mechanisms. So one is the ways in which manipulation can be distinguished from persuasion. And so if I'm trying to persuade you of something, I'm taking your rational capacity and your agency, I'm respecting you as a person, I'm presenting you with reasons why you should agree with me and why you should change your behaviour. And that is me respecting and trying to persuade you. Manipulation is when you bypass that respect for that capacity and you use emotions, or you try to control them by trying to make them feel a certain way. And generally this corresponds with manipulating them to undertake behaviours that are actually quite harmful to them, although there is some room for debate about that. And so the two ways in which it can sort of happen is it can happen at an individual level, where I try to manipulate you or my mom or someone else to try to do exactly what I want them to do. But then you have institutional levels, and these are most commonly known as oppression. It's when you have a systemic system, or a system in which certain cultural, religious, social norms are used to oppress a class of people and to control their behaviour at that group level. And so this can happen through socialization, this can happen through economic sanctions, this can happen in a variety of ways. And so what I did in my PhD work was I looked at how systems of oppression, particularly using Iris, Murray and Young's 5 Faces of Oppression, where you have things like domination, powerlessness, violence, cultural imperialism, and you sort of try to see the ways in which norms are used to control people's behaviour. And so I looked at the ways in which this can happen at a psychological level, so the ways in which we actually internalise oppressive norms and then seem to self-discipline ourselves in accordance with them. And so when you actually sort of believe them to be true, or you believe them to be important, and no one needs to tell you what to do because you just sort of act in accordance with it. And then there is also the environmental level. So this is sort of those forced choice situations where technically you could do the thing that you want to do, but the consequences of doing that are so severe that it's not really a reasonable option for you. And so taking these two sorts of mechanisms, the ways in which oppression occurs at systemic levels, I applied them to enhancements, specifically genetic enhancements. Then I realised that genetic enhancements don't exist, and you can't actually ask anyone the reasons by which they pursued them. And so I looked to existing case studies of where enhancements already occur to try to draw some lessons for a future of genetic interventions. So in my PhD, I did just cosmetic enhancements, and I, as every PhD student does, decided to do way too much. And I wanted to do a study on cognitive enhancements, but I didn't have time. And for the love of my supervisor's sanity, I did not have the words. So I proceeded to work on this in my postdoctoral research and have since sort of folded it into my new book. So beginning with cosmetic enhancements, this is sort of the one I was most nervous about because I wasn't sure if I was being feminist or anti-feminist in anything that I said in this space because it can be highly politicized and controversial. But nevertheless, I went ahead and I wanted to ask the question, why do so many women pay exorbitant costs in time, in money, and bodily harm through things like cosmetic surgery for cosmetic modifications that men do not? I was very interested in this. And so I looked towards 3 different groups of oppression that intersect depending on the individual at different levels. And I looked to patriarchy, I looked to capitalism, and I looked a little bit to racism as well. And so I began with the classic sort of 1960s to 1980s feminism that talked about how beauty is coded as a woman's moral duty. There's a really great quote from Plato or some of the other like really old philosophers from ages back talking about beauty being a virtue. I just don't care to figure it out because I'm so mad they said it in the first place. And so essentially, beauty is not about beauty, it is about power. It is about controlling women's behaviour. And for this reason, beauty norms are intentionally unsustainable and impossible to achieve. In my own time of being a woman able to make my own decisions, beauty norms have flipped from being the super skinny Britney Spears body shape, the white body shape of the 2000s, through to the Kim Kardashian bod in the 2010s. And we're going back to the gym bodies now, and we're also somehow scarily making our way back to those really super skinny bodies again. And the reason they keep changing is because they are intentionally impossible to achieve. Beauty is not about actually how you look, it's about power, it's about control. And so in order to continue to control, you need to continually change the body standards. And so for this reason, beauty norms are inherently patriarchal, they are inherently racist. They are trying to get us to look very specific ways for the very intention of controlling our behaviour and keeping women generally subjugated. Now, I acknowledge that patriarchy can also affect men as well, but I was primarily interested in the dominant scholarship and one specific case study, generally because it's a PhD and you only have so much space. And so then I was not only interested in patriarchal beauty norms, I was interested in how capitalism intersects with this. So capitalism is inherently an economic system that is dependent on permanent growth. There are 2 ways to continue to grow the economy. One is to make more people who will buy more things, and the other is to make each person buy more things. And so this is sort of known as consumerism, or the hedonic treadmill. The ways in which we are continuously convinced to buy more goods is to make us feel less than without, so that we buy, we feel good, then that very quickly expires because consumerism changes it again to buy something new that you need in order to have self-esteem, to have self-worth, to have that sense of belonging, to have that label to know that you are worthwhile, and then it changes it again. And so the ways in which patriarchy and capitalism intersect here is through the cosmetic enhancement industry. We see media posts, we see advertisements. There's so much delicious scholarship analysing the ways in which media constantly says, find your inner beauty, find your inner power, girl. And it's there, like I don't need the product in order to find it, but I'm made to feel that I do. And, for these reasons, I have my emotional support makeup for the days in which I just can't be bothered to fight the patriarchy just another day. So it's just easiest to just put it on and just go on to, do a talk that I'm a bit nervous about. And so we see the cosmetic enhancement industry ranging from beauty products such as makeup all the way through to cosmetic surgery is one of the most profitable markets. I remember seeing a statistic that said, I don't know if it's true, but the global economy would essentially collapse overnight if we all stopped buying beauty products. We see it was worth 480 billion in 2024. It's projected to reach 900 billion by 2030. Making women feel terrible about their bodies is a highly profitable business. It is one of the most reliable ones in a patriarchy. And for many women like myself, it sort of ends there. But for many women, particularly for women of colour, it doesn't end there. And they face compounded pressure through white supremacist ideals, particularly in Western societies, that pathologise race as a medical problem. And there is so much literature in Black feminist areas talking about the ways in which Black women are perpetuated against by these white ideals, particularly around skin colour and skin lightening procedures. And then there's also some really excellent scholarship by Eve St. James Aquino, I think at Macquarie or Wollongong, talking about Asian features and the pathologization of Asian features through the medicalization of double eyelid surgery. And so I didn't have the time during my PhD to go into this, and I'm really grateful for my book being able to go into it a bit more. and that these compounding systems of oppression can be so psychologically overwhelming, but also environmentally overwhelming. So what I mean by this is that many women, myself included, we internalize these standards. There's nothing I can do about it now. It's too late. I've been socialized to be this way. I see my appearance as important. And sometimes that mascara is what is standing between me and my self-esteem. And I don't have a choice. It's just the way I do value it, even if I don't want to. And so in these situations, cosmetic enhancements are not the individual creativity. They are not me finding my inner power. They are armor. They are a way to defend myself in a society that is out to judge me. And then there is also, for many women, particularly women of colour, where white supremacist ideals stand between them and basic goods, there is an environmental manipulation where it's either conform to these patriarchal and racist beauty norms, or it's not be employed, or it's not feel safe, or it's to be continuously questioned as to whether or not you're a professional in your workspace or deserving of that job. And again, in these situations, conformity is not an individual choice. It is not just the individual creativity. It is a negotiation for basic goods. That is not what autonomy means. I love this quote by Julia Gillard, the Not Now, Not Ever book. She says, women don't need fixing. We do it because the world is infused with misogyny. I love this because it shows that the problem is not us. We are not weak. We are not pathetic. We are not irrational. We are doing what we can in a society that is constantly trying to make our lives more difficult. But feminism didn't stop there, obviously it kept going. And 1990s feminism sort of brought about this idea of choice feminism, this idea that tried to recognise that women are agents. We are doing what we can in a society out to get us, and we are trying to use our choices as best we can. And for that is autonomous. They argued that beauty is empowerment. It is taking back what has been taken from you in an effort to sort of fight back a bit. They are trying to argue that women are not passive victims of patriarchy, and trying to argue that cosmetic modification reflected personal identity, and it was a form of self-determination. And so they did argue that denying women these choices is itself paternalistic, which is inherently anti-feminist. And this is quite challenging. It sort of seems to say you can't critique a woman's choice because every choice a woman makes is feminist. And if you go against that, then you might be lumped in with a group of people that you were trying to criticize in the first place. But there has been some excellent work since, which recognises that a lot of this choice feminism, which is actually brought about through consumerism, through the media, it absorbs feminist language to silence the feminist critique. You can then never say anything against it because then you are positioned as inherently anti-feminist. And so when we also look to this idea that it is just the individual expression of how they want to look or how they see themselves, we realize that we are coincidentally all trying to look exactly the same. And that cannot be a coincidence, especially when the ways at which we are trying to look are those that exactly correspond with patriarchal beauty norms. There are no butt surgeries to make your butt super flat. There are no tummy surgeries to make it bigger. There's no surgeries to give you bags under your eyes or wrinkles on your face. They are all doing the exact same thing all the time, with give or take different racially identified and profiled cosmetic surgeries. And so one of the other things that I wanted to push back on was this idea that, well, I actually do feel better when I wear mascara. I do feel better when I wear makeup. I feel good. I can go about my day. But there's this really great quote by Simone de Beauvoir when she talks about that women often feel satisfaction in their position as other. And it's just, it's not meant to be a critique. It's meant to recognize that when you have been socialized to value very specific things, of course you're going to feel good when you actually achieve them. But happiness doesn't equate with well-being. Well-being is an authentic evaluation, and it's not necessarily a moral judgment. It's just to say that happiness is not, in fact, what it means to have well-being. There's this really great quote by Carol Hay, which talks about understanding women's obedience to patriarchal beauty standards as bondage rather than a choice. Makes sense of the intuition that there is a problem. It's not with women, it's with the world, which is what the feminists of 1990s feminism were trying to do. They were trying to identify if there was a problem, or just try to say that there wasn't really a problem so that we stopped pointing the finger at women. So my claim here is not a claim about women's weaknesses or irrationality or even a problem with their inauthenticity because they happen to be women. It is a claim in the same way that when we talk about the social determinants of health, how some social determinants are not there in order to be considered healthy. I'm arguing that oppression prevents the conditions for enhancements to contribute to well-being because they deprive us of the opportunity to exercise our authenticity. So I took this analysis and I wanted to do a similar one to cognitive enhancements. Cosmetic enhancements have been well done in the feminist literature, and I think there was something more novel to say in the space of cognitive enhancements, particularly because as I was going through law school, I was watching a lot of my friends use off-label Ritalin or modafinil to try to get through crim or evidence. And it was just a really interesting and novel time for my generation to be trying to just, in my honest opinion, to survive. And I'm interested in the ways in which a lot of literature on cognitive enhancements talks about the intrinsic value of intelligence and how intelligence is essential to human flourishing and therefore more of it is better. And so I cracked my fingers and I was like, all right, take two. I was surprised they cracked. And so once again, I looked for a surprising trio of oppression or oppressive norms. And I looked to the meritocracy, I looked to credentialism, and I looked to capitalism once again, mainly because I firmly believe so many problems come from capitalism, and I think that's a really non-controversial thing to say. Anyway, so the meritocracy is the opposition of the aristocracy, which is the idea that you deserve your goods, your position in life based on who your parents are or what your postcode was. Meritocracy is meant to be the idea that you get where you're going in life. Everyone has a fair go. As long as you put in enough effort and you try your hardest, you'll get where you deserve to go, and we will reward you accordingly. And it's an ideal, and I think, as I will show in a minute, I don't think it actually ever existed. Credentialism is sort of the certification of the meritocracy. We reward merit and we stamp it with actual certificates and degrees, which correspond with both socioeconomic value, in that those who have degrees inevitably go on to earn significantly more and have more power in their lives than those who don't have credentials. And then combine this in the capitalist economy in which we are situated. These sorts of judgments and certifications go hand in hand with basic goods in our society. So let me go through with them a little bit more. And this is not my greatest slide, so I'm really sorry. I should have worked on this one a little bit more, but yeah, thanks AI for putting this one together. So basically, I argued that the norms and the judgments we make in a meritocracy are not, in fact, independent ideals of merit. They are based on incredibly gendered and patriarchal, as well as racist norms of intelligence. So the way I did this was I looked at our education systems and standardization tests and the things that we study in school, the things that we're judged on, the things that determine which universities we go to, which degrees we get into, which in turn determine which jobs we get and how much we earn, are very specific subjects. And they are inherently masculine, or what has been considered to be traditionally masculine, and they are inherently quite often deeply racist. So the way in which I analysed this was, when you look at the subjects we do in school, we study math, we study comprehension as English, we study Shakespeare, and we study science and history and geography, and there are no subjects called tolerating cultural difference, or not bullying, or caring for your friends, or how do you care for someone who's in the advanced stages of their life? How do we try to regulate our emotions? We are not ever judged or awarded merit based on what is traditionally considered to be feminine traits. And this is what Alison Jagger says is the divorce between the mind and the body as to the masculine and the feminine. And the way I see that is inherently problematic, because then when we go on to see in a capitalist society, jobs that are traditionally feminine, such as aged care, just healthcare in general, education, early childhood education, traditionally feminine roles are systemically paid less. Their job security is far less. It's more often part-time. And with that comes obviously superannuation concerns and massive gender pay gaps. Then I also argued that they are inherently racist. So looking at the ways in which standardization testing arose out of the eugenics period, which was the every attempt of white men to justify their superiority by arguing that Black people were inherently inferior. And the ways in which our standardization testing has co-opted those methods of tests. We test for very specific ideas of IQ, and we actually exclude First Nations knowledge inherently in Australia, the ways in which First Nations English is considered to be bad English, quote unquote. The ways in which in America, schools that are predominantly Black students are the ones that traditionally or systemically do poorer and then go on to be closed down because they are schools that are not doing well. And we have so much literature to show that standardization testing does not test intelligence, it does not test merit, it doesn't even test problem-solving skills. It tests for socioeconomic position and race. And so given that we use these tests to then go and determine who gets into university, we similarly test for similar skills at university. And then we based credentials on these very specific ideas of merit, which in a capitalist society is then what is rewarded with basic goods, economic security, power in your life. Iris Moran-Young talks about the ways in which certain jobs and certain degrees allow you to rise up and have autonomy over your work, and why so many classes of individuals, such as those with that are differently abled, those in the aged care, they just get excessively excluded past a certain age. We say you're no longer able to work. The ways in which if you can't work full time, you're excluded because having caring responsibility precludes you from having autonomy and power in your work. And so I argue that when we look at this system, where cognitive enhancements fit into this, the way that we often use them in school, in university, in the workforce, is not because you are so excited to read Shakespeare and understand what he said in Part 2, Act 5, line 13. I don't know, I didn't do it. Or to read a book about case law and evidence from end to end. It's because we just don't have a choice. If you don't pass that exam, if you don't do well, there's no coming back. You have to spend more money. You have to get into a different university. You don't get access to that job if you don't do well according to these very specific norms of intelligence. And so this cycle just reinforces oppressive norms, particularly in a meritocracy where we are told if you do well, good on you. You've worked really hard. You deserve that. But it also goes the other way, which is if you don't do well, you are blamed. You had a fair go. Why didn't you do well? And so when we put cognitive enhancements into this picture, they don't necessarily look as a free choice. They might be because you have internalized these norms and we actually believe them. I've been there. Or it's because you just don't have an environmental choice. It's either take them and try to do as best as you can, or potentially sacrifice some really basic goods that you've been working really hard for. And so I realized that this is a very bold claim to make, and that people may point back at me and go, but isn't intelligence intrinsically valuable? If we put aside those positional goods and we just measured cognitive enhancements on their own, they are inherently good for you. And this is the idea that it's non-controversial to say that being capable of intelligence is a good. But my concern is with the word enhancement, which inherently means more is better. And so I just don't think it's true. I think that, and one of the most evidence-based areas of well-being psychological research is showing how intelligence actually has a negative correlation or association with well-being. One of my best mates, one of the smartest people I know, overthinks to a T. We see this so reliably in evidence that intelligence, as it is currently measured, has a negative correlation. The more you have, the less well-being you're predicted to have. I also think that just conceptually speaking, there's a really great argument by Michael Haskella that talks about how better reasoning can actually make us better at pursuing bad goals. Some of them, just because you're smart doesn't mean you make good decisions. Just because you're smart doesn't mean you're a good person. And I also think that better memory can also trap us in really embarrassing moments. And I'm waiting for the day a pill comes along and I can just I can forget all those regrettable things that I've done, or just not have to be reminded of that as I'm falling to sleep at night. I already have to turn down my car radio when I'm parking because I just can't concentrate. I don't think having more hearing or more awareness of that moment is really going to help me. And so I think of intelligence as sort of a threshold good in which you have goalposts, in which those goalposts are established because you're just simply capable of conceiving of an ideal life. And you can kick a goal through there and you'll have well-being. I don't think intelligence widens them. I just think it shifts them. Once you are, the more intelligent you have on those standards, you just have different priorities, different values. You see the world differently. And it doesn't mean it's easier for you to have well-being. And as we know from evidence, actually, it sort of seems to close them a little bit. And so if intelligence is therefore a threshold good, then cognitive enhancements are not categorically, generally, or conceptually good for you. They are not about optimizing well-being. They're simply about negotiating and maintaining a life that should have been ordinarily available to us in a system without oppression. And so bringing this sort of back to genetic enhancement, I think all the arguments I've just made already apply to genetic enhancements. We cannot categorically claim they are improving our well-being, but I also think that genetic enhancements are different in at least a couple ways. One, cosmetic enhancements are already widespread. They are normalized, they are fairly lawful, and many of them are localized or reversible. Cognitive enhancements, increasingly socially accepted, tolerated. We're not going to be snitching on our friends anytime soon. The risks, however, are largely unknown, and we are still working through some of the science in that space. Genetic enhancements are different. I'm not sure if I'm sort of being a bit of a genetic essentialist here, but I do think that there may be some conceptual differences worth talking about. One is that they are the most invasive. They happen at the protein or cell level of your body, not just on the skin or on the outside of a particular muscle. They are permanent. They are in some cases heritable, and they are the most risky. We have very little evidence for their safety. And I also think that the idea that they encode oppressive norms into human DNA is one of the most concerning things to me. So the Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf talked about this idea that cosmetic enhancements are a way that we can self-discipline or self-police. We can sort of put armor on to just sort of get by. But genetic enhancements are a form of coding. They code the body in accordance with oppressive norms. And I think that is one of the most terrifying things about this kind of enhancement. And I am open to the criticism that I might be being a bit of a genetic essentialist here. But if that is not an attractive argument to you, I do think that the is does not infer ought one has a good stronghold here. Genetic enhancements are not here. They're not going to be here for a little while, at least. And so we have a very rare opportunity in the history of the agency dilemma to not put an option on the table and then whip it out from underneath people who have been relying on it to get by. And this is why I think it's different to things like cosmetic enhancements and cognitive enhancements. What are we going to do? Tell women they can't wear makeup, take cosmetic surgery off the table? It is already a way in which many of us have just depended to find our self-esteem, and I think it would be cruel and problematic to whip that out from under them. But genetic enhancements are not like that. No one is relying on them yet to get by. They are incredibly risky, and we have a really good amount of time to talk about them before they come. And so my overarching argument is that genetic enhancements are just not beneficial, generally speaking, particularly the ones that we are about or respond to and conform with oppressive norms. And I've talked about cognitive enhancements. I've talked about appearance-based enhancements. I think there is a lot more research to be done on others. I'm very interested in the way life extension enhancements might not apply to this framework at all. But generally speaking, I just don't think we can make categorical general claims about them. And I think anyone who does should be subject to these sorts of questions. And so what I think this means for the ethics of enhancement debate is we need to recalibrate it. So we've got this big idea that we only need to talk about justice or social impact. But if there is very minimal intrinsic benefit, if any, then the harms that they cause are far more weighty and far more significant. And so just a couple of final things. I'm not making a claim about all enhancements. As I said, I'm really interested in life extension enhancements. I would be interested to see if there are any ways in which oppression results in us wanting to live longer other than sci-fi fiction novels and Marvel. And I do really believe that many people actually pursue cosmetic enhancements and cognitive enhancements authentically. I do believe there are some people out there who just manage to it doesn't affect them. But the exception doesn't dissolve the rule. And I'm also not making a claim about intelligence or rationality of women or anyone who uses these enhancements. I'm saying that the structural conditions for the determinants of autonomy in decisions about enhancements are just not there. And I'm calling for suspicion, not necessarily prohibition. I don't think that just broad speaking, prohibition is always the best answer or the most contextual answer to a problem. I'm just asking that we need to be really suspect of the kinds of claims as to who is telling us that we should want it and looking to see where they might benefit from that particular decision. And there are 2 papers that some of this is about. So that's it from me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sinead. I could tell that you've had 3 years of work that you were trying to put into a slide.
Oh, sorry.
No. There's just so many interesting ideas. And, the thing I really love about your paper and the presentation is getting this scholarship from these other areas and applying it to this new area, genetic enhancement. And, I was very convinced about how these things, we do need to think about this autonomy question and how we get these desires and things. I think, and in terms of the idea of maybe giving feedback that you can maybe incorporate into the book, my main thing for me stood out sort of right at the start, right at the end, is the scope of your argument and that you don't want to include embryos, you don't include genetic selection. This is happening now. Like you can go, there are companies now where couples are going and say, I'm doing selection. I want the child to have my eyes. I want it to have green eyes, or I want the tallest, child. So, it's happening right now, I would include it. That's, I think it's really, really interesting. I do think another quick thing that maybe we can chat afterwards, because it's probably boring for people that don't do as enhancement, just the conceptual issues about how you're going to define enhancement versus therapy. You had anti-aging there as an enhancement, but we allow, FDA approves like anti-aging things as a therapy. It prevents age-related decline, so it's just an interesting thing to put in there. And I guess, so one kind of challenge that I guess I would throw up, and let's just talk about cosmetic enhancements. So yes, I totally buy it. We've got all these sort of really corrupting forces on what we think is good body image and what women desire. But what is the answer? So say, yes, that's not an authentic desire. That doesn't contribute to your well-being, but you did say it can contribute to your happiness. So I imagine you get people who are saying, yes, look, I want this surgery to make myself look pretty. Say, look, this is an authentic desire. But they say, well, I don't care about my authentic desire. I just want to be happy. I don't care about this more idealized well-being. I just want to be happy. And I think you'll find that with genetic cases too. Say it's doing genetic enhancement for height, because we think that taller, especially for boys, there's all this data that suggests if you're taller, you're more subjectively happy. And presumably that's kind of not based on something organic about height. It's based about something about these sort of social expectations. So it just seems to someone that you could be, well, I want to get taller. And you would say, no, look, you don't authentically want this. But they'll say, well, I want it, but I don't want to be happy. So I just think it's interesting to sort of think about that type of issue too. And I guess it goes to the policy sort of implications about some of these things. So look, maybe I want to see if we get questions from the audience, and maybe I'll just give you those two things for now. If you want to quickly respond, and then go to questions, and then I'll come back to some other stuff.
I'm really interested in that question of, okay, well, if authentic well-being is not on the table in this particular choice, then is happiness the next best thing? And I think, happiness is better than being miserable, but it's not the same as making a categorical claim that it's good for you in the well-being sense. And I'm okay to make that distinction, but that distinction needs to be made really clear. And if someone is arguing for enhancements on the basis that they make you happy, I want them to acknowledge that happiness is not well-being. And that is a very different claim to be making about the normative importance of that good. And then I also think that the point, well, do we just say, no, you can't have cosmetic enhancements. No, this isn't good for you. I don't think that's where we necessarily need to go. And I sort of think that's why choice feminism arose, because it was the question of, so what? What do you want? Are you saying that like women can't make choices about this? And I don't think so. I think that if we look to Anne E. Card's work on oppression, and called Analyzing Oppression, she talks about responsibility in the face of oppression. And she gives this really helpful metaphor that says, if we're all trapped in a room and it needs all of us to open the door, then one person that doesn't try to open that door brings all of us back, keeps all of us trapped in. And so it's this idea of how can you attribute responsibility when you are yourself a victim of oppression? And sort of the way I had to think about it was, I think the answer comes down to privilege and who has the privilege to resist the consequences of those norms. So as a white woman, I don't experience certain forms of oppression, which means that when I don't conform to certain beauty norms, I do not experience consequences the same way a person of color would, which means that it is my responsibility to use that privilege to resist those beauty norms where I can, so that the next person down the line doesn't similarly feel that pressure to do so. And so I think the answer comes down to privilege and what it is in your power to resist without unreasonable consequences to your well-being. And so I think that we don't need to criminalize or regulate that. I think that's more of a social thing that we need to sort of share around and maybe educate. And then at the regulatory level, when it comes down to asking how should we offer cosmetic enhancements in a society rife with patriarchal and racist beauty norms, there's some really great work by Claire Grant, who wrote a book called Intact, and she just wrote this list of questions that we should ask ourselves or have a healthcare professional ask us before we then go on to use these sorts of forms of enhancements. And Ainsley Newson and Lisa Dive have done a little bit of work on this in a paper called Reconceptualizing Autonomy for Bioethics, sort of incorporating those substantive and procedural accounts of autonomy to suggest that we just need conversations, no presumptions about what people want or what people think for themselves, but to ask, like, do you know where these are coming from? And most often, I think there's a podcast, Abby Chatsfield, that's a lot. She had this whole moral dilemma about whether or not she wanted to get the nose surgery. And she had this really great quote, and I'm not going to swear or repeat the way she actually said it. But she said that, of course, I know that in a perfect world, I wouldn't want this, but I don't. Like, we live in a big brother world where everyone is watching all the time. And that's the society I have to live in. And so I think that if we have these conversations where we all sort of know the real reasons why we're all doing these sorts of things, and someone actually sits you down and asks you, like, perhaps have you considered these are the reasons why you might doing it, and how you feel about those reasons, and how you feel about your responsibility to respond to those reasons and your other ways of addressing those reasons. I think that's sort of my sort of relational approach to this sort of regulation, rather than a strict criminal prohibition, like judgment sort of regulatory approach. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much, Sinead. It was a wonderful seminar. Really, really interesting.
Thanks for having me.
Just for those online, I've just popped the details for the next Helen seminar in the chat. And for those online, it's on the 11th of August and it's about gambling harms and dark gambling advertising. So you'll find the details on the Helen website. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, Sinead, and thanks, Chris. Thank you.